Okay, now we're ready to go. So this is about creating accessible components. As you guessed, it's a talk on accessibility, but with particular regard to sort of user interface widgets and things that are all using JavaScript. So, important philosophical question, who am I? Something I ask myself quite frequently. My name is Kat. I work at the BBC over in Glasgow. So I'm a web developer. I'm not an accessibility expert, really. I'm an accessibility champion, as well as being a web developer. So my kind of daily work is developing. But what does an accessibility champion mean? Well, at the BBC, we do have a team of accessibility experts who used to kind of do audits and tell people off, need to fix this. But they figured out that wasn't really the best way to get people to make things accessible, and decided to create a network of champions who are kind of spread out in different teams and all kinds of people, so like developers, designers, testers, and so on, who, as alongside their normal jobs, just have to care about accessibility, learn about accessibility, and kind of champion it, and always be thinking, how can I make this more accessible? And get together every so often and kind of just talk about accessibility, and that's really cool. So yes, I'm not an accessibility expert. I don't have all the answers, but I'm hoping that today what I can do is give you some of the questions so that you know what to ask, and then you know how to find your own answers about how to make things more accessible. So, since I've become an accessibility champion, I've actually started to get really excited about accessibility. I really love it, because I think it's not just about kind of not getting in trouble and making sure that we get more, that we're keeping all our customers. Obviously, those are very good reasons to care about accessibility, and especially if you have to convince your boss about it. But through the network, I've met quite a lot of people with disabilities who've actually been really excited about how technology is actually improving their lives, and how they can use things to make daily tasks easier. I'm not talking about expensive specialist equipment, but I'm talking about things like this and smartwatches, phones. There's so many features now in phones and watches and things, relatively inaccessible things that people that are portable as well. And it's really kind of changing people's lives. And it's amazing the creative ways in which people are using things as well to improve their lives. So what's exciting for me about accessibility is the idea that things that we're working on that we might think are fairly mundane, like just e-commerce things and websites that let you plan travel and things like that. These can actually let people live a lot more independently, especially in conjunction with other technologies. So, it's really exciting to be part of that, I think. But the kind of flip side of it is that as the world becomes more used to being online and governments expect us to do things online, people just kind of assume that it's easy for people to do things. And if we don't think about accessibility, it can actually be harder for them to get help to do things like, for example, I met someone who had to drop out of their university course because all of the course material was online. Unfortunately, an assistant wasn't very accessible, which meant that basically all the tutors and things, their attitude was, well, it's on a computer, you can use a computer, so why can't you access all the course materials? So that's why it's really important for everyone to be thinking about it. So, I think what's really important to think about is how are people using your app, and there's all sorts of different ways that people are using your applications. So this is just a list of some tools that people might be using that you might not have thought about. So screen magnifiers, which just kind of make everything bigger. Screen readers is probably one we're all familiar with. These read out not literally necessarily what's on the screen, but make everything accessible through an audio interface. Braille displays, got a picture of one of these actually. So that's a Braille display, which I think is pretty cool because it just pops up the little bumps under the user's fingertips, so they can feel Braille is very similar to a screen reader, except it's producing Braille rather than speech. And also haptics. This is one that's pretty cool. On the Apple Watch, for instance, you can enable prominent haptics, which allows people to get physical feedback from the watch. So I met somebody who was saying they can actually use, who was deaf and blind, but can actually use this in conjunction with Apple Maps to go to places on their own. With the guide dog, but not having to have a guide, going to new cities, being able to find their way around, because it can be set up just to kind of give one buzz to go left, one to go right, that sort of thing. So oops. So that's quite interesting. Also, how do people interact with your user interface? So you might be familiar with a mouse and a touch screen. People also may be using only the keyboard. Some people can't use a mouse or can't see where the mouse is pointing on the screen. Another thing is switches. So that's kind of a pretty general, kind of vague term, but there's all sorts of instant devices that are basically just kind of interacting by producing a limited number of signals. Say, for example, fit switches, something called a sip and puff device, which is like a straw that responds to pressure. So someone can actually, who has no use of any of their limbs, can control things by just blowing into a straw. And these are often connected to an on-screen keyboard, which they can then control. And also voice input is one that's kind of increasingly used. Just people again using their mobile phone, using Siri or the Google one to do all sorts of things. So these are all things that you might be needing to think about. That's a lot of things, isn't it? So how do you get started with this? So as developers, it's not always easy for us to have access to all these different devices, and it would take ages and ages to test on all of them. So what I'm hoping to do today is just to show you there are a few simple things you can do, which will then kind of apply to many of these other situations. For example, if you're testing with a screen reader, that's probably mean it's going to be, it's going to be pretty similar on a Braille display and so on. It's essentially the same technology that's behind them, they're just different forms of output. So where to get started? I'm going to kind of not spend too long on visual accessibility, but it is a really important one because there's so many people who are affected by various different visual impairments. People who may be registered blind but that have some vision might just need a screen blown up really big, but also there's a lot of people that are colourblind. Even people who've lost their glasses, for instance, might be needing to think about visual accessibility. So there's a few simple checks that you can do. So one is you can just zoom in. I would say get into the habit of zooming in whenever you're developing something. You can use grayscale mode. So on a Mac, for instance, you can just go into the settings and set it to grayscale, and that'll give you a pretty good idea of what it might be like for someone with colour blindness. So although it doesn't actually show you all the different types of colour blindness, if you've got a good difference between the saturation of colours, then people should be able to differentiate between them even if they can't differentiate between the hues. So if you put it into grayscale and everything works fine, then that should be good. And also, of course, people often change the font size on their browsers, so you should do that. Make sure that everything, all the relationships stay the same, don't break down, you don't get things overlapping. So here's some good practices for visual accessibility. Use relative units, so rims and so on, for spacing as well as text sizes, so everything doesn't kind of end up all overlapping. Use SVGs, so you've got scalable images. Try and avoid having text in images, and try and choose colours with sufficient contrast. There are online checkers you can use where you can actually just put in 2 different colour values and see if they've got sufficient contrast to appear next to each other. Also checking it in the grayscale mode. And don't rely on colour alone to convey information, so don't just use a traffic light system for saying something's okay, and try and have an icon as well, like thumbs up or a smiley face, something like that. So keyboard accessibility, this is where it gets more interesting for when you're developing interfaces. So basically what you need to do is make sure you can tab to all the interactive elements, that you can see focus, and that controls are operable with the standard keys. So what does all that mean? I'm going to just dig into that a bit now. So, I should have warned you about that. Okay, so there's some animation coming up. There's also sound hopefully, if it works later on. So okay, a bit of animation. So this is just a very simple accordion. Who doesn't love an accordion? So there, that's just showing it being clicked on. That's how it works. Here's the HTML behind it. And there's some code. So we've just got a simple click handler here. It just toggles the visibility. So the first thing we're looking for is whether you can see the focus when someone tabs onto it. So what I'm going to do is, so I think most developers have access to a keyboard, so it's pretty simple to do these checks. So here I am. I've just put these buttons in so you can see where the focus is. And you can see at the moment it's just skipping right over it. So we've got that. So obviously someone who's just using the keyboard wouldn't be able to use this at all. They just wouldn't be able to click on any of, or activate any of the headings. So that's pretty simple to fix. We can just add a tab index, and you want to set it to 0, so then it will show up in the focus order, and you don't really want to get into like changing the, using one. Don't use a positive one. Set it to 0. Otherwise things might behave unpredictably. You can also use -1 if you want something to not be tabbable too. If you want something visual, but you don't want people to be able to tab to it. So here we go. Now we can focus on these, but it doesn't really show up that well. So I just did a bit of styling to make it match the hover. So now we can tab onto those, but still can't click them. So the next thing you need to do is to add keyboard support. So that's really as simple as just adding a key press handler. I'm sorry, that's kind of disappeared because I increased the text size and then that happened. So here I'm just checking for the enter key. You may want to check for the space key as well, depending what kind of element it is. But I've just basically, that then uses the same toggle function as the click handler. So it's usually good practice to have the same handler for basically the same event happening for click and key press. So just keep everything so that exactly the same thing happens when you use the keyboard as when you use a mouse. So we can open it up. Hooray. So standard keyboard controls are basically tab for moving between elements, shift and tab for going backwards, and the arrow keys. Usually you want to make sure you can use tab and shift and tab, and then the arrow keys kind of on top of that to make things quicker, especially if you're moving in like a grid or something to be able to go left, right, up and down. Enter is usually for clicking on a link, space for activating a button, and maybe sometimes also like moving into an area where there's more widgets so you can interact with them, and escape, to get you out of things. So as far as possible, you should try and just stick to using these. I'm going to come back to those in a bit for when you need to do more complicated things that you can't do with this. So screen readers. Now screen readers can seem a bit intimidating, I think, if you're not used to using one, because it's kind of someone shouting at you and you've got to remember lots of buttons. But there are lots of screen readers that are available to developers. I'd say this isn't like a comprehensive list by any means. This is kind of what's available to us as developers that we can easily use, so we can just get into the habit of checking things with the screen reader as we're developing them, rather than kind of leaving it till later and testing it. So I think it's really good to just get in the habit of doing these things as you work. So on a Mac, we've got VoiceOver, which you can just activate with Command and F5. So it's as simple as that. For Windows, there's loads available for Windows, but NVDA is free and a pretty good one. On Linux, we've got Orca. I've never used it at all, I'm afraid. I didn't want to leave Linux people out, but that's what you've got. And on Android, you've got TalkBack, and on iOS, VoiceOver. And I would say the best way to get started if you've not used the screen reader before is to use the mobile ones, because these are a lot easier to use. You don't have to remember loads of different key combinations, because on the desktop, it just kind of take over your whole and change all the takes over a lot of common keyboard commands and changes them into screen reader ones, so it is a bit intimidating. But on mobile, it's generally just a case of swiping and just getting in the habit of double-clicking rather than clicking. So if you're interested in learning more about how to use a mobile screen reader, then come to my discussion session. I'll try and help you get set up and answer any questions you've got. So the first thing we want to be asking is, are the controls perceivable? Can we actually see what widgets are there? We want to know what it's called, which tells us something about what it's going to do. And the type of widget, because then we'll know how we can interact with it, and what its current state is. So, if you've got a checkbox, then you need to know whether it's checked or not, because if you don't know if it's checked, how do you know whether you should check it? So, those are the important things we're looking out for. Okay, so I'm just going to start with very simple. What if you want to create some, like a little toggle input, because you don't like any of the elements that are available for doing this, or they're ugly or whatever. So, you might not choose to do it like this. It's kind of like a deliberately bad example. So we're just using divs and spans here, and we're going to turn those into a kind of toggle. And again, we've just got a very simple toggle and key press handler there. So, okay, this is where we're going to have some sound. So I'm going to turn it like not too loud to begin with. Oh, actually, no, we're not going to have sound, I don't think. I'm not sure if that's the right plug. No, it's not working. Just press play, okay. You can see how loud it is though. No, it's not doing sound. What I can do is, I can just read it out. So this is actually something that's quite nice as well. I did plan for this eventuality. So on the voiceover at least, you do get, you can have a visual readout of what it's saying. So I could try and do like my best computer voice. So carrot, group, turnip. I don't think it's saying that, no, it's just saying group, 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 which isn't very useful. You are currently on a group inside of HTML content, interactive items, etc. So, did you get what happened there? It's just saying group, group, group. I'll just play again. So, it's reading out carrot, turnip, and kohlrabi, but only when you're going on the labels. It's not saying, there's no indication that that's something you can interact with, basically, and then it's saying group, group, group. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. So, that's just not very useful. So before I go about how to fix that, I'm going to tell you a bit about how a screen reader works. So, every operating system has an accessibility API. So these have been around mostly, I think, since like the kind of mid-90s, a lot of them, which provides all the information that's needed about the desktop and all desktop applications. Provides information to assistive technologies about what objects are there and how the user can interact with them. And then the assistive technologies choose how to present that to the user. So how does the browser come into this? So the browser, as we all know, it takes your document, turns into the DOM. Also, alongside that, it creates an accessibility tree, which is like a parallel structure to the DOM. They don't really interact at all. The browser just creates them both separately. Sometimes if there's changes to the DOM, we'll go and put the changes in the accessibility tree. But not everything. It depends. If it's something that the browser believes is going to be useful to assistive technologies, then it'll put it in accessibility tree. If not, then it'll just ignore it. So, and then the accessibility API makes that available. Assistive technologies query it. What that does mean is that you get a lot of different combinations of like browser, accessibility API, assistive technology, and they all kind of handle things a bit differently. So, it's quite difficult sometimes trying to support everything perfectly. So, I think it can be a bit like sort of earlier days of the web. Trying to do something exactly the same on everything isn't necessarily going to work. But what's important is to get the basics there. So, coming back to our example. So, yes, we made up our own checkboxes. So the solution is nothing complicated. It's like, why not just use a checkbox in the first place? So we can, this is an example of how I've actually, so obviously we can't style a checkbox itself exactly how a designer might necessarily want us to, but we can do some things, like for example here, just use a screen reader friendly way of hiding it. It's quite important not to use like display none or anything like that to hide things, because then the screen reader won't pick it up. So this is one way of hiding something so the screen reader can still read it. Another one is just to kind of off-screen it with like a margin. So you might not like how I've done that, but it's just to show there are ways and means. So there we go, now this will read out. Carrot, unchecked, checkbox. Carrot. Turnip, checked, checkbox. Turnip. Kohlrabi, unchecked, checkbox. So that's actually telling us what they are, what state they're in. When we interact with them, it'll say that. So, yes, first things first, rules. You should always try and fix things in HTML first. Use the most appropriate element. Semantic HTML gives you free accessibility. All standard HTML elements generally have excellent support in browsers and are going to give you much better results than making things up, kind of trying to fill in the blanks yourself. Use labels so you know what things are, and provide text alternative icons. So, in summary, if you want to make something that cracks, you probably don't want to start off with a donkey. You're much better off using a duck, because it'll probably do a better job of the flying and everything as well. So going back to this, let's go back to this example and see how that works with the screen reader. So heading level 2, animals, clickable. So it does at least tell us it's clickable, but then what? I've clicked it. It doesn't tell you anything else, it just says you're on heading level 2 inside of a list. Okay, I clicked it, what happened? So what just happened? I'm going to tell you to use the accordion elements. No, I'm not, because sometimes there are things that don't exist in HTML. So that's why we have to fill in the blanks, that's where ARIA comes in. So ARIA means Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's been a web standard since 2014, it's been around a lot longer than that, but it's now a full standard that all browsers support. And it provides information, so basically this provides the missing information from the browser to the accessibility API about all the stuff telling it all the stuff that you're going to need to put in the accessibility tree. So roles, what is it? States, what's it doing right now? So what the checkbox is doing right now, and properties. There's all kinds of different things that are properties. So like it's accessible name is a property. It's a pretty vague distinction, really, and to be honest, it doesn't really matter that much. In general, states things that might change, properties not necessarily. But so what we can do here is add. I'm just going to show it in HTML. You can add them in by JavaScript as well. So we're going to start off with ARIA expanded equals false on our heading there, which is the element we're clicking on. Not necessarily the best element to be clicking on, but for the sake of a simple example. So ARIA attributes begin ARIA dash and then something else. So put in ARIA expanded equals false so that we know that it's close to begin with. And then when we in our click handler or toggle function that our click handler will use, we're going to just toggle those attributes. So we're going to change ARIA expanded. We've also got ARIA hidden on there, although that's not strictly necessary. That's for the what we're going to show and hide, because screen readers will pick up anyway that it's hidden in the CSS. So now when we use this, saying all that. Okay, so now it says collapse, heading level 2, animals clickable. I click on it. And it says expanded, heading level 2, animals clickable. So now we know whether things are expanded or collapsed, then you know if there's something else next. So there is something in here that unfortunately doesn't work on VoiceOver, but it's still really useful to put in. So this is ARIA controls, there we are. I should have highlighted that as well. So ARIA controls, and that's showing that this element controls, so this heading element controls the list. So in some screen readers like JAWS, that will then say, press this combination of keys to go to the controlled element. So that's really handy if you've got elements that are quite far apart. And Just because all screen readers don't support it at the moment doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, because I think there's a lot of things like that. I'd say it's kind of a fairly recent standard. If we use things and kind of put pressure on vendors to implement them, then hopefully they will. And it doesn't do any harm, that's the main thing. It doesn't kind of, it's not going to cause any errors. It'll just be ignored by things that can't do anything with it. So general kind of things to remember when you're using ARIA with JavaScript. ARIA doesn't do anything in itself. It just describes behavior. So you still have to implement all the functionality. You still have to implement all the functionality and just use ARIA to tell the accessibility API what your element does. It's good to add appropriate attributes on initialization of the JavaScript rather than in the HTML. I did it in the HTML there just for kind of simplicity, but because you don't want to be telling a browser the API that it does something before it actually does it. So if you just add those in at the same time as you load your JavaScript, then that's going to be a bit more accurate if for some reason you can't load the JavaScript. And yes, you need to remember to update ARIA attributes when a component changes state so that a user knows that they've checked something or done something. So ARIA design patterns, as I said earlier, when I was talking about keyboard functionality, there's some really simple keys that you should support in everything, but exactly how do you use those? And sometimes you have more, need something a bit more complicated. So there are these ARIA design patterns, and what these describe is expected behavior, basically, like expected keyboard functionality. So if you say that something is an accordion, for example, if you put it on well, there isn't an ARIA role accordion, but like ARIA role tabs, for example, this lays out what functionality is then expected, so that when a screen reader tells somebody this is a set of tabs, then they'll know what keys they're used to using with their screen reader to operate that. So as long as you've implemented that according to specification, then it should be easier for somebody to understand how to use that your widget. So finally, what about AJAX? So this is like quite a complicated area for screen readers, because screen readers only say one thing at a time. If you have different bits of the screen kind of checking things and updating, how do you get that information across to the user? So here we've just got a little button that's going to ask the internet, like, go and check Twitter and everything, find out how cool I am now. So I'm not even going to show you the JavaScript for that, because it's pretty simple. You just click the button, and then it's going to go and pretend to do some AJAX and just update it a bit later. So, got the main point there. So what we can use is adding ARIA Live, which basically tells the screen reader this is going to get updated at some point, so listen out for changes. So here we are, listen out for changes by adding ARIA role. It needs to be ARIA role as a region. ARIA Live polite. You can also have ARIA Live assertive, which is like a polite name for rude, really. So what this does is basically the screen reader won't interrupt whatever else is being read out. So if you're using it in the middle of something, you're not going to just be interrupted. But ARIA assertive would kind of interrupt them. So you should only use that for like really, really important things. And really, you should probably even not use live that much. It's just, when it's something that the user's probably going to want to know and isn't necessarily going to think to check back. So I do need to think really carefully about how to use it. This is such a shame I can't play it, because it's like so nice to get insulted by the computer. But never mind. I'll just do an impression of my computer insulting me. This is what I got into technology for, really. Okay, so when I click How Cool Am I button, press How Cool Am I Now button. You are so not cool, says the computer. That's how she says it. Press it again. So there's a bit of a pause. Cool as a polar bear's elbow. It's so much better if the computer could tell me that, but never mind. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening. Sorry I have gone totally over time. And now go and listen to your website.